The evening began without urgency, the kind of quiet weekday night that barely registers as memorable. It was early fall in rural Indiana in 2002. The air had started to cool, but the day's warmth still lingered inside the small, single-story house on the edge of town. 17-year-old Angela Booth had been alone there before. Her mother worked late shifts at a local care facility, and by that age, Angela was considered responsible enough to handle a few hours by herself. There was no argument when her mother left that night, no sense that anything was wrong. Just a reminder to lock the door, heat up leftovers if she got hungry, and call if she needed anything. Angela had grown up in that house. Every creak of the floor, every sound the walls made after dark was familiar to her. She wasn't reckless, but she wasn't particularly fearful either. Friends described her as cautious, introverted, someone who preferred predictability. She spent that evening doing ordinary things, watching television, flipping through a school notebook, pacing between rooms when boredom set in. Nothing about the night suggested it would end differently from dozens of others before it. At 9:42 p.m., the stillness was broken by a phone call that should have changed everything. The 911 dispatcher answered as they always did, expecting the usual mix of traffic complaints, domestic disputes, medical scares. Instead, a young female voice came through the line. It was quiet. Not frantic, not screaming. Just controlled enough to sound deliberate, but strained in a way that immediately stood out. The caller identified herself as Angela Booth and gave her address. She did not rush through it. She spoke slowly, as if choosing each word carefully. The dispatcher asked what the emergency was. There was a pause. Angela's breathing was audible, uneven, as if she was trying to keep it steady. She started to speak, then stopped. When she tried again, her voice dropped lower. She said she was scared. She said something was wrong. She did not say why. Another question came through the line, calm and procedural. Angela didn't answer right away. There was a faint sound in the background, something indistinct, not loud enough to identify. Her breathing quickened. She repeated that she was at home. She sounded like someone trying not to be overheard. Then, abruptly, the line went dead. The entire call lasted less than a minute. Within minutes, patrol units were dispatched to the address. On paper, it was a welfare check prompted by a vague distress call. There were no reports of a crime in progress, no explicit threat described. Still, the response was swift. Officers arrived to find the house dark, except for a faint glow from the television inside. The front door was unlocked. They announced themselves as they entered. No one answered. The house was quiet in a way that felt complete, as if it had been left undisturbed. Angela was nowhere in sight. The first sweep of the home revealed nothing overtly alarming. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damage to the doors. The furniture was in place. The kitchen looked exactly as it should have, with a half-finished glass of soda on the counter. In the living room, the television played softly to an empty couch. Angela's shoes were by the front door, exactly where she usually left them. Her backpack was in her bedroom, resting against the wall. Her phone was off the hook in the kitchen, the line still open. It was the kind of detail that could mean many things, and at that moment, it was treated as just that. A detail, not a warning. Officers moved through the rest of the house, calling her name. There was no response. They checked the backyard, the side yard, the nearby street. No one had seen her leave. No one reported hearing a disturbance. The neighbors' lights were on, but their windows revealed nothing unusual. With no visible evidence of a struggle and no indication of forced entry, the initial assumption settled quickly. Angela may have panicked. She may have misunderstood a noise or a shadow. Teenagers ran away sometimes. Sometimes they left abruptly and returned just as abruptly once fear wore off. The dispatcher's notes reflected that uncertainty. The call was logged as a non-specific distress. The responding officers noted the absence of obvious danger signs. By midnight, Angela Booth was officially listed as missing. Her mother returned home later that night to a scene she never imagined walking into. Police cars outside her house, officers waiting to speak with her, questions she couldn't answer because she didn't understand them yet. She kept asking the same thing, over and over. Where was her daughter, and why hadn't she called her first? When she was told about the 911 call, the confusion turned into disbelief. Angela didn't call emergency services casually. She wasn't dramatic. If she had been scared enough to dial 911, something had terrified her beyond her ability to explain it. Her mother insisted that Angela would not have left the house barefoot, without her backpack, without a word. She would not have disappeared voluntarily. But the early hours of a missing persons case are fragile, shaped as much by assumptions as by evidence. Without clear signs of violence, the urgency softened. The house was secured, but not treated as a crime scene. No forensic team was called in that night. No neighbors were canvassed until morning. The call itself, the only direct link to Angela's state of mind in her final known moments at home, was reviewed briefly and filed away. The recording was described as unclear, too quiet, too short. Not enough information to draw conclusions. As the night wore on, the absence became heavier. The house felt wrong without Angela in it, not because anything had changed, but because nothing had. Every familiar object remained where she had left it, as if she might walk back through the door at any moment. But she didn't. Those first hours slipped by quietly, without alarms or urgency sirens cutting through the dark. By the time morning came, the narrative had already begun to form. Not officially, but subtly. A frightened teenager, an overreaction, a disappearance without evidence of foul play. Yet one question lingered beneath all of it, unanswered and uncomfortable. If Angela had simply panicked, what had she been afraid of? And why had her voice dropped to a whisper when she called for help? The 911 call became the center of everything that followed, even as it was pushed to the margins of the investigation. A young girl had reached out from inside her own home, asking for help she never received. Something had interrupted her. Something had ended that call. And as the night she vanished faded into morning, the truth remained suspended in those final seconds of audio, unexamined, unexplained, and already beginning to slip away. Morning came without answers. The sun rose over the same quiet street, the same modest house, as if the night before had passed without consequence. But inside the Booth home, everything felt suspended in an unfinished moment. Detectives returned early, no longer responding to a vague welfare concern, but to the absence of a 17-year-old girl who had vanished after calling for help from inside her own home. This time, the approach was slower and more deliberate. Not urgent in the way a clear crime scene demands urgency, but careful in the way uncertainty forces restraint. The house was searched room by room, not because something obvious had been missed the night before, but because something invisible might still be there. At first glance, nothing contradicted the initial assessment. Furniture remained in place. There were no broken objects, no stains, no marks on the walls or floors that suggested a struggle. The doors showed no signs of forced entry. To anyone unfamiliar with the family, the house looked normal. Almost too normal. But investigations rarely turn on what is obvious. They turn on what doesn't quite fit. Angela's bedroom was small and tidy, the kind of room that reflected routine rather than chaos. Her bed was made loosely, as if she had sat on it earlier in the evening. Clothes were folded on a chair. Her school books were stacked neatly on her desk. Nothing appeared disturbed. But one detail drew attention almost immediately. Her bedroom window was open. It was late fall in Indiana. The temperature had dropped sharply overnight. Opening a window for fresh air made little sense, especially for a girl described as cautious and easily chilled. The screen was intact. There were no footprints below the window outside. No clear sign that anyone had entered or exited through it. Still, it was open, and no one could explain why. In the kitchen, investigators paused over something that would have gone unnoticed by most people. One of the chairs at the table was slightly out of place, angled away as if someone had stood up quickly. It wasn't overturned, it wasn't dramatic, but it didn't match the rest of the room, where everything else felt static, frozen in the exact configuration Angela had left it. Her diary was found in her bedroom drawer. It was a simple notebook, filled with short entries about school stress, future plans, and small daily frustrations. The last entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, 2 days before she disappeared. There was no explanation, no sign of emotional distress, no mention of fear or conflict. Just an unfinished thought that stopped without warning. On their own, each detail meant very little. An open window, a moved chair, an incomplete diary entry. None of it rose to the level of evidence. Together, they created a quiet discomfort that settled over the investigation without offering direction. Detectives began reaching outward, trying to build a picture of Angela beyond the walls of her home. They spoke with her teachers, who described her as attentive, reserved, and consistent. She wasn't known for acting out or skipping school. Her grades were steady. She didn't seek attention. When she was absent, it was noticed. Friends painted a similar picture. Angela wasn't the type to disappear impulsively. She had a small circle, mostly girls she'd known for years. She didn't date. She didn't sneak out. She didn't talk about running away. If anything, she was described as cautious to a fault, someone who thought carefully before making decisions. There was no digital trail suggesting preparation for a disappearance. Her online activity was minimal, limited to school-related research and occasional messaging with friends. There were no secret accounts, no unexplained communications, no plans made quietly in the background. Every interview pushed the same conclusion closer to the surface. Angela Booth did not look like someone who had chosen to leave. Her mother repeated that belief relentlessly. She described a daughter who disliked being home alone at night, who locked doors even during the day, who called to check in if she felt uneasy. The idea that Angela would step out into the dark, without shoes, without her belongings, without telling anyone, felt impossible to her. And yet, that was the only explanation the evidence seemed to support. With no clear crime scene and no immediate suspect, police were forced into a familiar position. They split the case into 2 working theories. The first was the most unsettling. Someone had entered the home briefly. There had been no struggle because there had been no time. Angela had sensed something wrong, enough to call 911, but not enough to describe it clearly. Whatever happened next occurred quickly and quietly, leaving no obvious trace behind. The second theory was less disturbing, but no less troubling. Angela may have misinterpreted something harmless, a sound, a shadow, the sense of being watched that sometimes comes with being alone at night. Fear took over. She called for help, then calmed herself, decided she had overreacted, and left the house on her own. Neither theory fully explained the facts. One required an intruder who left no evidence. The other required Angela to act completely against her known behavior. At the center of both possibilities sat the 911 call. The tape was reviewed again, this time by investigators rather than dispatch supervisors. They listened carefully to the sound of Angela's voice, to the pauses between her words, to the way her tone dropped lower as the call continued. It was clear she was frightened. What wasn't clear was why. There were no audible threats, no clear background noise that could be identified, no sounds of a struggle, nothing concrete enough to justify a different classification of the call. It was deemed inconclusive. The decision was made not to release it publicly. At the time, the reasoning felt practical. Releasing unclear audio risked fueling speculation. Without a confirmed crime, there was concern about privacy, about misinterpretation, about causing unnecessary panic. The tape was logged as evidence and placed back into storage. That choice, made quietly and without controversy, would come to define the case. As the day progressed, the sense of urgency began to dull. The longer Angela remained missing without evidence of violence, the harder it became to justify an all-out search. Resources were allocated carefully. The case moved forward, but without momentum. Neighbors were questioned. None reported seeing Angela leave. None heard anything unusual. The street cameras at nearby intersections offered no useful footage. The timeline narrowed instead of expanding, collapsing inward around the same unanswered questions. By evening, the house was returned to Angela's mother. It looked exactly as it had before, and that normalcy became its own kind of cruelty. Every object felt loaded with meaning. Every sound at night felt threatening. The place where Angela had called for help now held only silence. For investigators, the lack of clarity was frustrating. For her mother, it was unbearable. The absence of evidence did not feel like reassurance. It felt like erasure. As days passed, the theories hardened without evolving. The intruder angle remained speculative. The misunderstanding theory remained unsatisfying. And the 911 tape, the one moment when Angela had been heard alive and afraid, remained locked away, its full significance unexamined. What no one realized yet was that the decision to treat that call as inconclusive had already shaped the future of the investigation. The most important clue in the case had been identified, listened to, and then set aside. And as the search for Angela Booth continued without direction, the truth remained buried in plain sound, waiting, unheard, for someone to finally listen differently. In the weeks after Angela Booth vanished, the investigation expanded outward, searching for something solid to hold on to. The house had yielded nothing definitive, so detectives looked beyond it, toward the people and places that might explain why a 17-year-old girl had been afraid enough to call 911 and then disappear without a trace. The first leads were predictable. A registered offender lived 3 blocks away, someone whose presence alone made neighbors uneasy once Angela's disappearance became public. Detectives interviewed him early, carefully, methodically. His schedule that night was confirmed by multiple sources. Surveillance footage from a gas station placed him miles away during the window when Angela made the call. The lead was logged and closed. Suspicion moved on. Attention shifted to a former stepfather, a man with a known temper and a complicated history with Angela's mother. He had been out of Angela's life for years, but the emotional residue of past conflict made him an obvious person to question. Investigators asked about his whereabouts. He provided receipts, witnesses, and phone records that placed him elsewhere. There was no physical evidence tying him to the house, no motive that could be substantiated. Another door quietly shut. With no clear suspect, the investigation began circling wider. Detectives spoke with administrators at Angela's school. They reviewed attendance records and disciplinary files. Teachers were asked if Angela had seemed troubled or distracted. No one reported anything out of the ordinary. She hadn't confided in a counselor. She hadn't shown signs of distress that would suggest she was planning to disappear. A nearby construction crew working on a road project was questioned next. The timing made sense. Strangers in the area, men working late hours, trucks coming and going. Their schedules were reviewed. None of them had been near Angela's home that night. None knew her. Another theory dissolved. Each lead followed the same pattern: initial interest, careful questioning, logical elimination, and then nothing. As the months passed, the case began to feel heavier, not because it was moving forward, but because it wasn't. Investigators continued to work it, but without the urgency that comes from fresh evidence. The early assumptions still lingered in the background, shaping decisions quietly. There had been no signs of violence, no witnesses, no clear motive. The possibility that Angela had left on her own still hovered, unproven but persistent. One name, however, kept resurfacing in ways that were easy to overlook. He was a family acquaintance, someone Angela had known for years. He wasn't a relative, but he wasn't a stranger either. He had been inside the Booth home many times before. He knew Angela's mother's work schedule. He knew when Angela was likely to be alone. His name appeared in early interviews, mentioned casually by neighbors and friends. He was described as helpful, familiar, someone who checked in on the family occasionally. When the detective spoke to him, he was calm and cooperative. He answered questions willingly. He offered explanations without hesitation. His interview notes were brief. There was no sign of nervousness, no contradictions that stood out at the time. He was categorized as low priority and quickly moved out of focus. What wasn't recognized then were the small inconsistencies buried in his account. The times he mentioned didn't align perfectly with the 911 call. His description of when he had last been near the house shifted slightly between conversations. But without the audio of Angela's call being scrutinized publicly, those discrepancies had nothing to anchor them. They existed on paper, subtle enough to blend into the noise of a case already crowded with uncertainty. As weeks turned into months, investigative fatigue began to set in. Missing persons cases without obvious violence are among the hardest to sustain. Resources are finite. New cases arrive daily, each demanding attention. Detectives rotated assignments. Jurisdictional responsibilities shifted as leads crossed county lines and then led nowhere. Each handoff meant revisiting old files, rereading reports, and then confronting the same lack of answers. Tips slowed to a trickle. The phone rang less often. Posters that once covered shop windows and telephone poles began to fade, curling at the edges under sun and rain. Angela's face, once everywhere, became easier to overlook. Her mother never stopped asking questions. She called the department regularly, sometimes with new ideas, sometimes just to ask if anything had changed. The answers were always careful, measured, and unsatisfying. The investigation was ongoing. No leads had been ruled out completely. They were still working on it. Behind those reassurances, the case was losing momentum. Internally, Angela's status was reevaluated. With no evidence that she was in immediate danger, her classification shifted. She was no longer considered an endangered missing person. The case was marked inactive, a bureaucratic decision that carried enormous emotional weight. Inactive did not mean closed, but it did mean quiet. The 911 tape remained locked away, referenced, but rarely revisited. It was still considered too vague to change the direction of the investigation. Releasing it was seen as risky. There was concern about public misinterpretation, about false confessions, about drawing attention to a case without new information to support it. The tape became something that existed only in reports and memory, not in public consciousness. Years passed. Angela's disappearance became a story people remembered imperfectly. Some recalled a runaway. Others remembered the 911 call, but not the details. Rumors filled the gaps left by silence. Each retelling drifted further from the facts. The family acquaintance remained exactly where he had always been, present but unremarkable. His name sat in the file, unhighlighted. He was never called back, in for a second interview. No one connected his timeline to the call in a way that raised alarms. Without a clear reason to re-examine him, he remained what he had been labeled early on: cooperative, unproblematic, forgettable. Investigators retired. New detectives inherited the case file, thick with reports, but thin on conclusions. Each time the file was opened, it told the same story. A girl disappeared. A call was made. Nothing followed. The absence of evidence slowly transformed into a kind of narrative of its own. If something terrible had happened, surely there would have been signs. If someone had taken Angela, surely they would have made a mistake. The longer the silence stretched, the easier it became to believe that the truth, whatever it was, had slipped beyond reach. For Angela's mother, time didn't dull anything. It sharpened it. Every year without answers reinforced the feeling that something had been missed, that the call mattered more than anyone had acknowledged, that Angela had been trying to say something and had run out of time. The case sat untouched for long stretches, interrupted only by anniversaries and occasional reviews prompted by policy rather than progress. Each review reached the same conclusion: no new leads, no new evidence. And yet, buried in the file, preserved in analog tape and aging paper, the most important moment of the case remained unchanged. The sound of Angela's voice, the timing of her words, the silence that followed. It waited, unnoticed, as years passed and technology advanced. It waited while the people who had last spoken to Angela aged and moved on. It waited while the idea of what had happened to her slowly hardened into assumption rather than fact. What no one could see yet was that the case had not stalled because there was nothing left to find. It had stalled because the wrong things had been dismissed too early. And as the investigation faded into the background of a town that learned to live without answers, the truth remained exactly where it had always been, held in a recording no one believed could change anything, waiting for the moment someone finally pressed play and listened closely enough to hear what had been there all along. Every case on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. Each episode takes nearly 15 days of research and long nights chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. And if you want to watch more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. Years passed in a way that felt uneven. Outside the Booth house, time moved forward as it always did. New families moved into the neighborhood. Roads were repaved. Businesses opened and closed. But inside that house, very little changed. Angela's mother never moved. She kept the same address, the same phone number, the same routine, as if leaving might somehow sever the last physical link to her daughter. Angela's room remained intact. Nothing was boxed away. Nothing was repurposed. Birthdays came and went without celebration, marked only by silence and the quiet weight of what should have been. The case followed a similar pattern. Detectives who had worked Angela's disappearance early on eventually retired or transferred. New investigators inherited the file without inheriting the urgency. Evidence boxes were stacked, labeled, and stored. The 911 tape sat inside one of them, preserved but untouched, its significance dulled by time and repetition. Every few years, the case was reviewed, not because something new had emerged, but because protocol required it. Each review ended the same way. No new leads, no movement. In the community, Angela's name faded into something less specific. She became a story people remembered imperfectly. Some recalled the call to 911. Others remembered only that a girl had vanished from her home. Over time, the details blurred. The certainty that something terrible had happened softened into speculation. The case took on the shape of a local ghost story, one that lingered without resolution, but no longer demanded attention. For Angela's mother, the silence was never passive. It was active, pressing in from all sides. She marked time through absence, what Angela would have been doing, how old she would have been. Each milestone that passed without her daughter reinforced the same thought. Someone had known something. Someone had heard something, and something had been missed. The 911 call remained the fixed point in her memory, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. Angela hadn't screamed. She hadn't begged. She had tried to explain quietly, carefully. That detail mattered. It meant Angela had been thinking. It meant she had been responding to something real. 16 years after Angela disappeared, the case file was reopened, not because of a tip or a confession, but because of a policy change. Across the country, departments were being pressured to re-examine unresolved cases involving emergency calls that ended without clear outcomes. Advances in technology had outpaced the tools used when those cases were first investigated. What once sounded like static no longer had to remain static. A cold case unit was assigned to audit Angela Booth's disappearance. For the first time in years, the file was read from start to finish by investigators with no personal history in the case. They weren't burdened by early assumptions. They weren't attached to previous conclusions. They approached it as a question rather than a narrative. The 911 tape was pulled from storage. By 2018, audio enhancement technology had changed significantly. Software could isolate frequencies, remove background interference, and amplify sounds that had previously been dismissed as meaningless noise. Technicians began working with the original recording, not a copy, but the tape itself. At first, the results seemed underwhelming. Angela's voice was still quiet. The call was still short. But as layers of interference were removed, details began to surface. Not new sounds, but clearer ones. There was movement in the background of the call, not loud, not chaotic. It wasn't the sound of someone rushing or panicking. It was controlled, deliberate, footsteps that didn't belong to Angela. Then there was something else, a voice, barely audible, overlapping with Angela's breathing. It wasn't clear enough to identify words at first, just the presence of someone else in the space. That alone was enough to change the tone of the room where the tape was being analyzed. The assumption that Angela had been alone began to crack. Technicians continued refining the audio. They slowed it down. They isolated specific moments. And then, buried beneath layers of noise that had once been dismissed as static, they heard Angela whisper something. It was brief, quiet, and it had never appeared in the original transcript. The phrase didn't sound like panic. It sounded like recognition. The implications were immediate and unsettling. Angela hadn't been calling because she imagined something. She had been reacting to a presence inside her home, someone close enough that she felt the need to lower her voice, someone she believed could hear her. Investigators revisited the timeline with this new understanding. The pauses in the call made more sense. The hesitation. The way Angela spoke as if she was listening for something between words. What once seemed vague now felt intentional. For the first time, the idea that Angela had been alone when she made the call felt impossible to defend. The cold case unit reviewed every interview conducted in the early days of the investigation. They compared statements against the refined timeline of the call. Small inconsistencies that had once been overlooked took on new weight. Times that hadn't mattered before suddenly did. The name of the family acquaintance surfaced again. This time, it didn't fade. His access to the house, his knowledge of Angela's mother's schedule, the way his statements shifted subtly around the time of the call. None of it was enough on its own. But now, with the possibility that Angela had been whispering to avoid being overheard, those details felt different. The biggest question became whether to release the tape. It was a decision that divided opinions within the department. On one side were those who believed releasing the audio could generate new leads, prompt recognition, or apply pressure to someone who had grown comfortable in the shadows of the case. On the other side were concerns about public reaction, misinterpretation, and the emotional impact on Angela's family. The tape was no longer just evidence. It was Angela's voice, her last recorded moments. Ultimately, the decision was made to prepare the tape for public release, with careful editing and context. The rationale was simple. For 16 years, the case had existed in silence. That silence had protected no one and helped nothing. Angela's mother was informed before anyone else. She listened to the enhanced audio in a private room, surrounded by people who didn't know how to prepare her for what she was about to hear. When the whisper played back, she recognized it immediately, not because she understood every word, but because she understood the fear behind it. It confirmed what she had always believed. Angela had not been alone. She had not imagined danger. She had been responding to it. Word of the impending release spread quickly, even before the audio reached the public. Journalists requested access. Advocacy groups took interest. Online communities dedicated to cold cases began revisiting Angela's disappearance, armed now with the knowledge that something concrete had been missed. For the first time in 16 years, the case felt active again. The house that had looked normal all those years ago no longer felt neutral. The call that had been deemed inconclusive now sounded deliberate, and the silence that had defined the case was about to break. As preparations were made to release the tape, investigators understood what would follow. Once Angela's voice was heard, the story would no longer belong only to the people who had carried it quietly for years. It would belong to anyone willing to listen closely. And somewhere, whoever had been inside that house the night Angela called for help would hear it too. When the tape was finally released, it didn't arrive with ceremony. It appeared online with a brief statement from the department and a warning about its content. 16 years after Angela Booth vanished, the public heard her voice for the first time. Not as a summary, not as a line in a report, as sound, as breath, as a moment that had been preserved longer than anyone had realized. The audio was unsettling in its restraint. Angela wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. Her breathing was shallow and measured, like someone trying to stay calm while something nearby demanded attention. There were pauses that felt intentional, moments where she stopped speaking altogether, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was listening. Each pause carried weight. Each breath sounded controlled, as if volume itself was a risk. Listeners noticed immediately that this wasn't the sound of a girl panicking alone. It was the sound of someone aware of another presence. The dispatcher's questions faded into the background of public discussion, replaced by the way Angela's voice shifted, lowered, tightened. The way she seemed to speak around something she didn't want heard. Then came the moment that changed everything. Near the end of the call, Angela whispered a single word. It wasn't loud. It wasn't emphasized, but it was unmistakable. A man's name. For years, the absence of detail had allowed speculation to drift in every direction. Now, with one word, the possibilities collapsed inward. The name didn't belong to a stranger. It wasn't generic. It pointed somewhere specific, toward someone who had already been in the file, already interviewed, already dismissed. The reaction was immediate and intense. Journalists revisited early coverage of the case, comparing timelines and rereading interviews with new attention. Podcasts and news outlets played the tape repeatedly, isolating the whisper, slowing it down, debating pronunciation. But there was little disagreement about what was heard. The name matched a person who had been close enough to Angela to recognize, close enough to be inside her home without forcing entry. Online communities dissected the audio with the kind of focus the original investigation had never applied publicly. They mapped the background sounds against the layout of the Booth house, identifying where Angela might have been standing when she made the call. The sound of movement didn't suggest someone searching frantically or trying to escape. It suggested proximity, awareness, control. One conclusion became difficult to avoid. Angela was not hiding. She was being watched. That realization reframed everything. The open bedroom window no longer felt incidental. The slightly moved kitchen chair felt deliberate. The way Angela gave her address calmly at the start of the call now sounded like an attempt to anchor herself before something interrupted her. Police moved quickly, aware that time, once again, mattered. The family acquaintance whose name appeared to match the whisper was brought back in for questioning. This time, the tone was different. This time, investigators had something solid to work from. They confronted him with the enhanced audio, with the refined timeline, with questions that no longer floated in abstraction. His initial responses echoed what he had said years earlier. He had been cooperative then. He remained so now, at least on the surface. But technology had changed since 2002. Cell phone records, once inaccessible or incomplete, now painted a clearer picture. His phone placed him in the vicinity of the Booth home during the narrow window when Angela made the call. Not nearby earlier in the evening, not passing through later. Right then. When pressed with that information, his account began to fracture. Small adjustments turned into contradictions. Times shifted. Explanations narrowed. He admitted to being near the house that night, then admitted to being there. He claimed he had stopped by briefly, claimed Angela had let him in, claimed nothing bad had happened. He denied harming her. Investigators listened, not because they believed him, but because they needed to understand the shape of the story he was trying to tell. The version he offered didn't match the fear in Angela's voice. It didn't explain the whisper. It didn't explain why the call had ended so abruptly. For the first time since 2002, the case moved forward instead of sideways. Search warrants were executed. Properties connected to him were examined. His movements around that time were reconstructed with a level of precision that had been impossible years earlier. Witnesses who had once been unsure now reconsidered what they remembered, prompted by the clarity of the tape and the weight of public attention. Angela's mother watched all of this unfold with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the truth was finally emerging. Dread at what that truth might confirm. Hearing the tape had been devastating, but it had also been validating. Angela had not been ignored by fate. She had been interrupted by a person. The community's response shifted as well. What had once been a quiet, unresolved disappearance became an active reckoning. People who had lived with vague theories were forced to confront something specific. Someone specific. The idea that the answer had been close all along settled heavily. Investigators understood the stakes. Releasing the tape had changed the case irrevocably. It had also changed expectations. There was now pressure not just to investigate, but to conclude, to provide an answer worthy of the years that had been lost. As the inquiry deepened, the family acquaintance's denials became more careful, more rehearsed. He admitted presence, he admitted proximity, but he maintained that Angela's disappearance had not been intentional, not violent. He positioned himself as a witness rather than a cause. But evidence does not respond to positioning. It accumulates, it tightens, it exposes gaps where stories cannot stretch far enough to cover facts. For Angela Booth, the sound of her voice had done what years of silence could not. It had shifted the center of gravity of the case. It had forced attention where it had always belonged. The whisper had broken something open. As investigators closed in, they understood that the next steps would no longer be speculative. The case had crossed a line from mystery into accountability. Whatever happened next would not restore what had been lost, but it would finally name it. And as the man whose name Angela had whispered sat under renewed scrutiny, the question that had haunted the case for 16 years came into sharper focus. Not whether someone had been there that night, but how much longer the truth had been waiting to be spoken aloud. The pressure that followed the tape's release was unlike anything the investigation had seen before. For years, the case had lived in quiet file rooms and private grief. Now it existed in public, sharpened by sound and scrutiny. Investigators no longer spoke in hypotheticals. They spoke in timelines, in measurable distances, in moments that could no longer be explained away. When the family acquaintance was brought in again, it wasn't framed as a conversation. It was a reckoning. The tape played in the room, not once, but repeatedly. The enhanced audio stripped of distortion. Angela's breathing, the pause, the whisper, the sound of movement that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Alongside it, analysts laid out the reconstructed timeline, minute by minute, placing his phone near the house at the exact window Angela made the call. The gaps in his earlier statements were highlighted, not dramatically, but precisely. At first, he held to the version that had protected him for years. He said he had gone to the house briefly, said Angela knew him and let him inside, said there had been a misunderstanding, a moment of fear that escalated too quickly. But the words began to lose cohesion as the evidence tightened. His calm eroded under repetition. Details changed when they could no longer remain vague. Eventually, he acknowledged entering the house under false pretenses. He said he hadn't planned to hurt her. He said Angela startled when she realized he was there. He said panic took over when she reached for the phone. He described the call as something that spun out of control, a moment where fear overtook reason. He claimed her death was accidental. Investigators listened carefully, not because they were inclined to accept the explanation, but because the shape of his story mattered. They compared his account to the physical evidence that had been missing for so long. To the audio. To the way Angela's voice sounded controlled, not chaotic. To the absence of any indication that she had believed she was safe. When pressed about where Angela went after the call ended, his answers slowed. The room grew quiet in a way that no recording could replicate. Eventually, he led them to a wooded property connected to him, a place that had never been searched because there had never been a reason to look there. The recovery of Angela's remains ended 16 years of uncertainty in the most irreversible way possible. The location was remote, but familiar to him, concealed by terrain that changed just enough with the seasons to keep what was buried from being discovered. Forensic teams worked carefully, documenting everything, knowing that what they recovered would be both evidence and a conclusion. Identification was confirmed through forensic analysis. The process was methodical, respectful, and devastating. For Angela's mother, the call that delivered the news carried a finality she had lived without for years. The uncertainty was gone. The waiting had ended. What replaced it was grief with edges sharp enough to cut. The legal process moved forward deliberately, shaped by the reality that so much time had passed. Charges were filed that reflected what could be proven, not what had been lost. Prosecutors weighed the strength of the evidence against the limitations created by delay. Witness memories had faded. Physical evidence from the house no longer existed. Decisions were made carefully, aware that justice delayed does not always arrive intact. Plea negotiations became part of the conversation, not because the truth was unclear, but because accountability had to survive scrutiny. The suspect ultimately accepted responsibility in a legal sense, though his version of events remained framed around accident rather than intent. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and the complexity of prosecuting something that should have been stopped in its first moments. In the courtroom, Angela's name was spoken repeatedly, not as a mystery, not as a missing person, but as a victim whose final attempt to ask for help had been recorded and ignored. The 911 tape was entered into evidence. Her voice filled the room again, quieter than any testimony, heavier than all of it. There was no celebration when the verdict was delivered, no sense of triumph, only a collective acknowledgement that the outcome, whatever its legal precision, arrived too late to matter in the way it should have. Angela's mother stood through it all, listening as the details were laid out in a structure that finally made sense. The whisper, the presence, the silence that followed. She had lived with those fragments without context for 16 years. Now they were assembled into something whole, and the completeness of it was almost unbearable. The case closed officially soon after. Files were updated. Evidence was cataloged and archived. The cold case designation was removed. On paper, the story reached its end. But endings like this do not feel complete. They feel corrective, as if something misaligned has finally been set straight, without undoing the damage it caused. The knowledge that Angela's voice had always been clear enough, if anyone had listened differently, lingered over every conclusion drawn. The 911 call that could have saved her had instead become a sealed artifact, locked away by caution and assumption. It had held the truth all along, not hidden, not encrypted, simply unheard. The delay had not been caused by a lack of evidence, but by the belief that evidence had to look a certain way to matter. When the tape was finally released, it didn't deepen the mystery. It ended it. The cost of waiting 16 years is measured not only in lost time, but in a life that never came home. Angela Booth's final act was to reach out for help from inside the place she should have been safest. Her voice carried enough information to change everything, if it had been allowed to. In the end, the story does not close with justice as resolution, but with reckoning, a recognition that listening matters, that hesitation has consequences, that silence, once accepted, can stretch across decades. Angela's voice remains, preserved in sound, no longer a question, and the truth it carried stands as a reminder that sometimes the most important evidence is not what is missing, but what has been there all along, waiting for someone to take it seriously enough to hear it.